Approximately 11 in the morning, Eastern Time, the President of the United States threatened to impose 100% tariffs on every single good coming from Canada into America. Not 25%, not 35%, 100%. A complete doubling of prices on Canadian imports. And the reason because Canada made a deal with China. Now, before you click away thinking this is just another Trump tariff story, I need you to stay with me. Because what's unfolding right now isn't just about tariffs. It's not even primarily about China. What we're watching is a fundamental realignment of North American power dynamics, and it's happening in real time with stakes that extend far beyond any single trade policy. The next 6 months will determine whether the most successful trade partnership in modern history survives or collapses entirely. Let me take you back 1 week. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney steps off a plane in Beijing. It's the first visit by a Canadian leader to China in 8 years. 8 years of frozen relations, of diplomatic standoffs, of trade barriers and retaliatory tariffs. And Carney, who took office just last year after replacing Justin Trudeau, is there to reset everything. Picture the scene. The Great Hall of the People in Beijing. Carney sitting across from Chinese President Xi Jinping, cameras flashing, interpreters whispering, and then after hours of closed-door negotiations, they emerge with an agreement that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Canada will allow 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into its market each year at a tariff rate of just 6.1%. In exchange, China will slash tariffs on Canadian canola seed from 85% down to 15%. They'll eliminate tariffs entirely on Canadian lobster, crab, and other seafood products. Carney calls it a landmark deal, a strategic partnership, the beginning of a new economic relationship between Canada and the world's second-largest economy. And here's what makes this moment so significant. Just 2 years earlier, Canada had imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. They mirrored the United States exactly. Same policy, same percentage, same rationale. Protecting domestic auto manufacturing from Chinese subsidized competition. But that was then. This is now. And now Canada is breaking ranks. The immediate reaction in Canada is split right down the middle. The prairie provinces, Saskatchewan and Manitoba, are ecstatic. Canola is their lifeblood. Farmers who watched their export market collapse when China retaliated with punitive tariffs 2 years ago suddenly see a path back to profitability. Premier Scott Moe calls it very good news. The seafood industry on the Atlantic coast celebrates. But in Ontario, where the auto industry employs hundreds of thousands of workers, Premier Doug Ford is furious. He calls Chinese electric vehicles spy cars and warns that the deal will tick off the Americans. And he's right, because 5 days after Carney signs the China deal, he boards another plane. This time he's heading to Davos, Switzerland, the World Economic Forum, where the global elite gather every January to discuss the state of the world and where, as it happens, Donald Trump will also be speaking. What unfolds over the next 48 hours in Davos becomes a defining moment. On Tuesday, January 20th, Carney takes the stage. The Congress Center is packed. World leaders, corporate executives, journalists from every major outlet. And Carney delivers a speech that lands like a thunderclap. "We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition," he tells the assembled crowd. "The old order is over. It's not coming back." He doesn't say Trump's name, he doesn't have to. Everyone in that room knows exactly who he's talking about. Carney speaks about coercion by great powers, about using tariffs as leverage, about treating supply chains as vulnerabilities to exploit, about middle powers like Canada needing to stand together because, as he puts it, if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. The audience gives him a standing ovation. Not polite applause, a standing ovation. In a room where American business leaders and European officials have spent the past year watching Trump threaten allies with tariffs, demand territory from Denmark, and treat trade agreements as negotiable suggestions, Carney's message resonates. He's saying what they've all been thinking but haven't been willing to say publicly. And then the next day, Trump takes the stage. His speech is vintage Trump. rambling, self-congratulatory, filled with threats and demands. He talks about Greenland again, insisting that Denmark must cede the territory to the United States or face consequences. He mocks unnamed foreign leaders for their negotiating skills. And then, inevitably, he gets to Canada. Canada lives because of the United States, Trump declares. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements. It's a direct shot. Personal, dismissive, the kind of rhetoric that might have intimidated previous Canadian leaders into backing down. But Carney doesn't back down. He responds by saying, Canada doesn't live because of the United States. Canada thrives because it's Canadian, because of Canadian values, Canadian democracy, Canadian strength. And that response, that refusal to bend, is what triggers what happens next. Trump withdraws his invitation for Carney to join something called the Board of Peace, a vaguely defined entity Trump created supposedly to oversee Middle East peace negotiations, but which most allies see as a vanity project with a $1 billion price tag for membership. Then come the social media posts. Trump attacking Carney, attacking the China deal, attacking Canada for being ungrateful. And then, this morning, the threat 100% tariffs if Canada moves forward with the China agreement. Now, here's where most coverage is getting this story wrong. The conventional analysis goes like this. Trump is angry at Carney for the Davos speech. He's retaliating. He's punishing Canada for daring to criticize him. And yes, there's an element of personal pique here. Trump doesn't handle defiance well. We all know this. But that analysis misses the bigger strategic picture because the 100% tariff threat isn't primarily about wounded pride. It's about something much more fundamental. It's about the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, the trade deal Trump himself negotiated during his first term, the agreement that replaced NAFTA, the foundation of $2 trillion in annual trade between the three countries. And here's the crucial detail that you need to understand. That agreement comes up for mandatory review in exactly 6 months, July 1st, 2026. By that date, all three countries have to affirm their commitment to continuing the partnership. If they don't, the agreement doesn't immediately collapse, but it enters a period of annual reviews that could last until 2036, after which it expires entirely unless renewed. This review has been on the calendar since the agreement was signed. It's not a surprise. It's not a last-minute development. For the past year, all three governments have been preparing. Canada and Mexico initially expected this to be routine. A few technical adjustments, maybe some updates to reflect changes in digital commerce or labor standards. Business as usual. But then Trump won a second term. And suddenly the review isn't routine anymore. It's existential. Because Trump has made clear repeatedly that he views the current trade relationship as unfavorable to the United States. He's already imposed 35% tariffs on most Canadian goods, with exemptions only for products that comply with the agreement's rules of origin. He's threatened to leave the agreement entirely. He suggested replacing it with bilateral deals that would give him more leverage over each country individually. And here's where China enters the calculation. Because one of Trump's biggest concerns, one that his trade officials have been raising for years, is that China is using Canada and Mexico as backdoors to circumvent American tariffs. The theory goes like this. Chinese companies ship components or partially finished goods to factories in Canada or Mexico. Those factories do final assembly, minimal processing, just enough to qualify the product as Canadian or Mexican under the rules of origin. Then the finished product crosses into the United States tariff-free under the trade agreement, even though most of its value was created in China. Is this actually happening at scale? The data is mixed. A Brookings Institution study from last year found evidence of increased Chinese investment in Mexican and Canadian manufacturing, particularly in sectors subject to US tariffs, kitchen cabinet makers, steel processors, electronics assembly. But the study also noted that proving transshipment is difficult because supply chains are genuinely complex. A car assembled in Ontario might have hundreds of components from dozens of countries. At what point does it stop being a Canadian car and start being a vehicle designed to evade tariffs? The Trump administration doesn't care about that nuance. They see the pattern. US tariffs on China go up. Chinese investment in Mexico and Canada increases exports from those countries to the US rise. To them, that's evidence enough. And Carney's decision to allow 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into Canada at a 6% tariff, while the US maintains 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. That looks like exactly the kind of backdoor arrangement they've been warning about. Now, let me be clear about what the Canada-China EV deal actually does and doesn't do. The agreement doesn't eliminate Canada's tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles entirely. It creates a quota. 49,000 vehicles per year can enter at the lower rate. That's roughly the same number that were entering Canada in 2023 before the tariff war started. Carney frames this as restoring the status quo, not opening the floodgates. And importantly, these vehicles are for the Canadian market. They're not automatically eligible to cross into the United States tariff-free. To do that, they'd need to meet the trade agreement's strict rules of origin, which require 75% of an automobile's value to come from North America. A Chinese-made EV assembled in China and sold in Canada doesn't meet that threshold. It's not eligible for duty-free entry to the US. But Trump isn't interested in those technicalities. His concern, or at least the concern he's articulating publicly, is that this deal is the thin edge of the wedge. Today, it's 49,000 vehicles. Tomorrow, it's Chinese companies building assembly plants in Canada to take advantage of the trade agreement. Next year, it's electric vehicles rolling off Canadian production lines, technically meeting the rules of origin because final assembly happened in Ontario, but with batteries, motors, and electronics all sourced from China. And from a strategic standpoint, Trump has a point. If you're trying to economically decouple from China, if you're trying to build a fortress North America that doesn't depend on Chinese manufacturing, then having your northern neighbor simultaneously deepening trade ties with Beijing undermines the entire strategy. It creates exactly the kind of arbitrage opportunity that makes comprehensive tariff policies impossible to enforce. But here's what Trump's approach misses. Canada isn't moving closer to China because Carney loves Chinese EVs. Canada is moving closer to China because Trump has made it impossible to rely exclusively on the United States. When you threaten your closest ally with annexation, when you call their Prime Minister Governor Carney and post maps showing Canada as the 51st state, when you impose tariffs on energy and manufactured goods for reasons having nothing to do with trade and everything to do with domestic political theatre, you force that ally to look for alternatives. Carney said as much in his Davos speech, though he phrased it more diplomatically. Our old relationship with the United States, a relationship based on steadily increased integration, is over, he declared. What he meant was clear. Canada can't afford to put all its eggs in the American basket anymore. Not when that basket might get kicked over at any moment for reasons that have nothing to do with Canadian policy and everything to do with American domestic politics. So, Canada is diversifying. That's the word Carney keeps using, diversification. Building trade relationships with China, with the European Union, with Indonesia, with India, reducing dependence on the United States from the current level where roughly 75% of Canadian exports go to American buyers. Carney has set a goal of increasing exports to China by 50% by 2030. That's ambitious. That's a fundamental reorientation of Canadian trade policy. And that reorientation is precisely what Trump is trying to prevent with the 100% tariff threat. Because if Canada succeeds in diversifying away from the United States, American leverage evaporates. Right now, Washington can threaten tariffs, and Ottawa has to listen because the Canadian economy would crater if it lost access to the American market. But in a world where Canada has robust alternative markets, where Chinese, European, and Asian buyers absorb what America rejects, those threats lose their teeth. This brings us to the absolutely critical context that makes the next 6 months so important: the trade agreement review. Because everything happening right now, all the threats and counter-threats, all the diplomatic posturing and trade deals with alternative partners, is positioning for what happens in July when the three countries sit down to discuss the future of North American trade. Trump wants to renegotiate the agreement on his terms. He wants tighter rules of origin that make it harder to qualify for duty-free treatment. He wants provisions explicitly targeting Chinese transshipment. He wants Canada and Mexico to align their China policies with American policy, which means maintaining high tariffs and restricting investment. Essentially, he wants to use the review as an opportunity to lock Canada and Mexico into America's geopolitical competition with China, whether they want to be locked in or not. Canada and Mexico, meanwhile, want stability. They want the agreement to continue largely as written. They want tariff certainty so businesses can plan investments without worrying that the rules will change every time Trump gets angry about something. They want the economic integration that has made North America one of the most productive economic regions in the world. But they also want sovereignty. They want the ability to make their own foreign policy decisions, their own trade agreements, their own strategic choices. And that desire for sovereignty is running headlong into Trump's demand for alignment. Here's where things get really complicated. Trump might not be bluffing about the 100% tariffs. Multiple legal challenges to his tariff authority have failed or been overturned. A federal court ruled last year that his use of emergency economic powers to impose tariffs was illegal. But appeals courts have reversed those decisions or narrowed their scope. For now, Trump appears to have the legal authority to do pretty much whatever he wants on tariffs, at least until Congress reasserts itself, which seems unlikely given Republican control of both houses. So, if Trump says 100% tariffs, he probably means it. The question is whether he's willing to follow through if Canada calls his bluff. Because 100% tariffs on Canadian goods would be economically catastrophic for both countries. Let me give you some numbers to illustrate the scale. Canada is the top export destination for 36 US states. Nearly $3 billion worth of goods and services cross the border every day, every single day. About 60% of US crude oil imports come from Canada, 85% of US electricity imports. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of steel, aluminium, and uranium to the United States. If you double the price of all those imports overnight with 100% tariffs, you don't just hurt Canada, you devastate American industries that depend on Canadian imports. Auto manufacturers that source parts from Canadian suppliers, refineries that process Canadian crude, construction companies that use Canadian lumber, energy companies that import Canadian electricity during peak demand. The economic modelling from the Tax Foundation estimates that Trump's existing tariffs are already costing the average American household about $1,000 per year in higher prices. 100% tariffs on Canada would push that figure significantly higher. We're talking about the kind of price shock that triggers recession, supply chain collapse, manufacturing shutdowns. Trump claims that won't happen because American companies will simply switch to domestic suppliers or find alternatives. But that's not how modern supply chains work. You can't just replace overnight a relationship that's been built over decades. You can't flip a switch and suddenly have enough domestic steel production to replace Canadian imports. These things take years to develop, and they require massive capital investment that companies aren't going to make if they think the tariffs might be reversed. So the smart money says Trump is using the 100% tariff threat as negotiating leverage. He wants to force Canada to back away from the China deal. He wants Carney to come to Washington, hat in hand, apologizing for the Davos speech and agreeing to align Canadian trade policy with American interests. But here's the problem with that strategy. It might not work. Because Carney has done something no recent Canadian leader has done. He's established publicly and definitively that Canada has alternatives. The China deal isn't just a trade agreement. It's a signal, a demonstration that Canada can and will look elsewhere if the United States treats it as a subordinate rather than a sovereign partner. And that signal is resonating beyond Canada. Mexico is watching. European allies are watching. They're all asking themselves the same question. If the United States is willing to threaten its closest ally, its largest trading partner, a country with which it shares the world's longest undefended border with economically ruinous tariffs over a single trade agreement with China, what might Washington do to us? This is the cost of Trump's approach that doesn't show up in economic models or trade balance statistics. It's the erosion of trust, the sense among allies that America can't be relied upon, that agreements are temporary, that today's commitment is tomorrow's bargaining chip. You can't quantify that erosion in dollars, but it has real consequences. When European leaders talk openly about strategic autonomy from the United States, when Asian allies expand military cooperation with each other instead of going through American command structures, when Canada makes a deliberate decision to reduce dependence on the American market, these are signs of a broader shift. The post-Second World War was built on American credibility, on the idea that Washington would honor its commitments even when doing so was inconvenient, that it would defend allies, maintain open markets, and provide the kind of stable, predictable leadership that made long-term planning possible. Trump's approach erodes that credibility with every threat, every about-face, every tariff imposed for reasons that have nothing to do with trade policy, and everything to do with forcing compliance. So, what happens next? In the immediate term, watch Canada's response. Carney hasn't issued an official statement yet about Trump's threat. When he does, the tone matters. Does he back down? Does he offer to renegotiate the China deal? That would suggest Trump's leverage worked. Or does he hold firm? Does he make clear that Canada will not be bullied into abandoning trade agreements with other countries? That would signal that we're heading toward genuine confrontation. Watch also for movement on the trade agreement review. The formal negotiations start in the next few weeks, though preliminary talks have been happening for months. US Trade Representative Jameson Greer has made clear that rules of origin and Chinese transshipment are his top priorities. If Canada and Mexico agree to significant tightening of those rules in exchange for tariff certainty, we might see a negotiated resolution. But if the positions remain far apart, if Trump continues threatening unilateral action while Canada and Mexico demand respect for their sovereignty, then the July review could become the moment when the entire agreement unravels. And if that happens, if the most successful free trade partnership in the Western Hemisphere collapses, the economic consequences ripple globally. Because here's what a lot of analysis misses. North American economic integration isn't just about trade volumes or GDP statistics. It's about deeply intertwined supply chains that have been optimized over 3 decades. An auto manufacturer in Michigan doesn't just buy parts from Canada and Mexico. Those parts are designed in collaboration with Canadian and Mexican engineers. They're manufactured using specialized equipment that exists because of long-term investment decisions predicated on stable market access. The components cross borders multiple times during production as they move through different stages of assembly and processing. You can't replicate that integration quickly. You can't just impose 100% tariffs and expect companies to adapt. What actually happens is production stops, factories close, workers get laid off, and because these supply chains are international, when American factories shut down, Canadian and Mexican factories shut down too. The pain is mutual. The damage is shared. Trump seems to believe that pain gives him leverage, that Canada and Mexico will blink first because they need the American market more than America needs them. And on paper, he might be right. Canada's economy is smaller. It's more trade-dependent. In a purely economic contest of wills, America has more resources. But this isn't just an economic contest. It's a question of sovereignty and self-respect. And Carney has calculated, apparently, that the long-term cost of submitting to Trump's demands exceeds the short-term pain of standing firm. That allowing the United States to dictate Canadian trade policy with China sets a precedent Canada can't afford to accept. That calculation might prove correct, or it might prove catastrophically wrong. We're going to find out over the next 6 months because something has to give. Either Trump backs away from the 100% tariff threat, tacitly accepting that Canada will maintain its relationship with China, or he follows through, triggering the kind of economic crisis that could define his second term. Or Canada blinks, accepts American terms, and the entire Davos speech becomes empty rhetoric. My read based on watching Carney's trajectory over the past year, he's not blinking. He's chosen this confrontation deliberately. The China deal, the Davos speech, the public responses to Trump's threats. These aren't accidents or emotional reactions. They're a strategy. Carney is betting that Canada can withstand economic pressure better than Trump can withstand political pressure from American businesses and voters hurt by his tariffs. It's a dangerous bet. History is littered with leaders who underestimated Trump's willingness to accept short-term pain in service of long-term objectives. But it's also a bet Carney may feel he has no choice but to make, because the alternative permanent subordination of Canadian interests to American demands isn't sustainable either. So here we are 6 months from the most important trade negotiation in a generation. Two leaders who've established public positions they can't easily back away from. 100% tariffs hanging in the air like a sword. And underneath it all, a fundamental question. Can the North American partnership survive an era when the United States treats allies like adversaries? That question matters far beyond trade statistics or tariff rates. It matters because the answer shapes the world our children inherit. A world where democracies cooperate, or a world where they fracture into competing blocs. A world where agreements mean something, or a world where power is the only currency that counts. We're about to find out which world we're living in. The next 6 months will tell us whether institutions can constrain leaders who don't believe they should be constrained, whether allies can maintain relationships when one partner demands submission rather than seeking partnership, whether the entire architecture of post-war trade and cooperation can survive an American president who views it as an obstacle rather than an achievement. The 100% tariff threat isn't just about electric vehicles or canola. It's about whether rules still matter more than power. And right now, the answer to that question is very much in doubt. If this breakdown helped you understand what's actually happening beneath the headlines, if you appreciated the context and the connections that most coverage is missing, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe, because this story is far from over. The next chapter gets written in July, and I'll be here to walk you through every development, every consequence, every moment when the stakes get higher. Tell me in the comments, do you think Carney will hold firm, or will Canada ultimately bend to American pressure? And more importantly, which outcome do you think serves Canada's long-term interests better? Because that's the calculation Carney is making right now, and it's one of the most consequential decisions any Canadian leader has made in decades. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next